Welcome. Welcome all to this sustainability lecture. I'm not Catherine Richardson, as you might have noticed. Climate is not weather, but Catherine, as a climate researcher, seems to know more about the weather than the rest of us. So she's relocated to Italy at this moment, not this town. And I've then had the pleasure to be here. I'm Ole Weber from the Political Science Department. And I'm just here to say welcome and to moderate the second part of this. So welcome, you all. I think we are all very fortunate here. I think we get today a chance to hear a lecture by the most important scientist in climate studies. And the reason why I think that Naomi Oreskes is the most important in the field is that there are very often a sense that we are doing all the science and then somehow the important battles shift onto somewhere else, and then we're no longer scientific when we go there. Somehow we can study all these different many subfields and aspects of climate studies, and then when the whole thing gets public, then the controversy shifts ultimately to the politics of knowledge, to issues like climate denial, or to questions like, is there really a consensus about climate sciences, and what does it mean whether there's a consensus or not? Or what about uncertainty? How should we discuss uncertainty when we discuss it both among scientists and in the public? And all these issues somehow usually shift us out of the domain of science, out to an area where everyone is amateurs, we're all just discussing common sense, but actually there's a science in those areas as well. It's possible to be scientific in the way we deal with issues like consensus and climate denial or uncertainty and so on. And in that growing field, there's no doubt that Naomi Oreskes is the central figure. So to the just more formal part of the presentation, she is at Harvard, where she's professor of the history of science, and quite interestingly at the same time, affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences, which I think is telling in itself, because if you want to do those things and being able to be scientific about this whole meta level of how we deal with things, you both have to know your history of science, sociology of science, but also have to know a lot about the sciences themselves that we deal with. She's the author of a number of books, most well-known, probably the co-author of Merchants of Doubt, this fascinating and very much debated book, and then maybe less known, this small book, which is a very depressing read about how it's all going to end, and I hope she'll not talk about this today. And then instead we will hear about another depressing subject, which is the continuation of climate denial, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, as Ulla said, my recent work has been mostly about the question of climate change denial. About nearly 10 years ago now, Eric Conway and I began working on the project that became the book Merchants of Doubt. I particularly like this version of the cover over here. This is from the Australian edition. When the book first came out, and I had a copy of the Australian edition at home, my daughter, who was about 15 at the time, picked it up and noticed this endorsement here from the West Australian, the largest newspaper in Perth, Australia, which called the book a sizzling page-turner. And my daughter looked at me and she goes, life must be really boring in West Australia. So it's important when you do these things not to let it go to your head. But in any event, I still appreciate the very kind and overly generous introduction. So climate change is a depressing subject. It's depressing because it's a worrisome thing, and it's depressing because we don't seem to be acting sufficiently on it. So I always like to start with some good news, and then we'll go downhill from there. So as you know, in the United States, we've been grappling with a very significant and persistent problem of climate change denial. But recently, we had some good news. This is reported from the Bloomberg business papers, a headline that says, Americans have never been so sure about climate change, even Republicans. And the report went on to present the results of a recent public opinion polling data, which showed that, sorry, the bottom of this is cut off, but this is from 2012 to 2015, so 2012 here, 2015 here, Not too much change among Democrats. Democrats are pretty on board about the issue. 80 to 90% of Democrats believe that climate change is happening, man-made climate change, but a big upward shift to nearly 60% of Republicans. And this is a big shift. You don't see shifts that big in public opinion polling all that often. So this was taken as a sign by many people that we had finally broken this deadlock of climate change denial. Here's the bad news, though. Actually, what this represents is a recovery from where we were nearly 10 years ago. 10 years ago, or well, 9 years ago, in 2007, the Yale Project on Climate Change did a major poll with the Gallup polling organization, in which they found at the time that about 72% of Americans were completely or mostly convinced that man-made global warming was happening. And in fact, we could go back even 10 years before that to 1997, and we would find pretty similar results. That is to say, the majority of the American people have accepted the evidence of climate change for a long time, but a persistent and substantial minority have not. And the other bad news, of course, is that that minority is not just a random minority. It's very much concentrated in the Republican Party, and it includes the leadership of the Republican Party, including the candidates who are aspiring to be the Republican nominee for president even today. So Eric Conley and I wanted to answer the question, how was it that so many people were persuaded for so long that man-made climate change wasn't happening when scientists were telling us beyond any doubt that it was? So Eric and I had the good fortune of having our book made into a film, and so I'm going to show you two film clips now that just summarize in a nutshell what this campaign looked like and how it was that confusion was created about this question through the principal strategy of creating doubt. So the first film clip I'm going to show you features Bill O'Keefe from the American Petroleum Institute, a trade organization that represents major oil and gas producers. You'll also see some other people from the industry, Lee Raymond, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. You'll see Don Blankenship. That's a name that probably doesn't mean a lot here, but I gave this talk in Ohio a couple of weeks ago, and I said Don Blankenship, and the room erupted. Don Blankenship was the truly evil CEO of Massey Energy, one of the worst coal mining companies in the history of mankind. And he, just 3 weeks ago, was actually convicted of conspiracy to violate federal mine safety regulations in connection with the Big Branch mine accident that killed, I think it was 21 miners. Anyway, so what you're going to see here is how doubt-mongering works, how these people try to create the impression that the science isn't really certain, we don't really know, and therefore we shouldn't do anything about it.
Bill O'Keefe is Executive Vice President of the American Petroleum Institute. He's also a board member of the Global Climate Coalition, made up of oil and electric companies, automakers, and others.
We believed it was a war on oil. They had an off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that.
I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted and misstated. And without
the science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. And so maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
There is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment to respond.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us, the way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
So there it is in a nutshell. This is what I love about film. 5 years of work, 500 pages of writing, and there it is in 2 minutes of film clip. But it's good. Film is powerful. One interesting thing, so that fellow Ned Leonard, who you just saw telling you that CO2 is good for us, that was from the early 1990s. about 7 years ago, I wrote a paper about that whole argument. Just yesterday, someone sent me an email saying, oh, the climate deniers have a new strategy. It's that CO2 is good for you. I was like, no, it's not new. They believe in recycling. You know, they recycle arguments. Okay, so now, so obviously these people are CEOs of oil and gas companies or people representing oil and gas companies. So one of the questions we had was, well, why did any of this seem credible? How did they manage to persuade journalists and the American people that these arguments had something behind them when we had the IPCC and the Royal Society and many other scientific societies telling us something that was quite different from what these people were saying? And so in the next clip, we'll show you one of the strategies that they used, a strategy that we call Potemkin village science, or sometimes I call it facsimile science, that then they dressed up their arguments to make them look like scientific arguments so that it became hard for people to tell the difference between the real scientific arguments and these pseudoscientific arguments that they were promoting. They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is the mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout and design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report.
So
the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
And how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same.
It's
the same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness.
All right, so obviously, as I've already said, Bill O'Keefe is not a scientist, Lee Raymond is not a scientist, the Cato Institute is not a scientific organization, but they've gone to great lengths to make it look as if their claims are scientific. So in this audience, I probably don't need to belabor this point, but I do like to stress that we can answer the question, what were scientists actually telling us during this period? And what we know, of course, is that as early as 1995, scientists were telling us that man-made climate change was underway. Most of you probably know that in the second assessment report of the IPCC, scientists had already concluded that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate. In my own historical study, I posed the question, did that IPCC report accurately reflect the views of rank-and-file scientists as reflected in published peer-reviewed literature? And the answer to that question was yes. And so I published what I guess in hindsight turned out to be the first scientific article stating that there was in fact a scientific consensus on climate change. And that was in 2004 that I published that article. Now when this article came out, it surprised many people, but really this should not have come as a surprise. It comes as a surprise in part because we have suffered from historical amnesia. In the film clip a few minutes ago, you saw Jim Hansen. He was the one scientist in the clip, the one saying, you know, well, the science is complicated. In 1988, Jim Hansen had testified in front of the US Congress that he was 99% certain that climate change was detectable. And in 1992, US President George H.W. Bush signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change and called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. He also promised to bring the power of the White House effect to solve the greenhouse effect. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change didn't come out of nowhere. It was, in fact, the culmination of a scientific consensus that was itself the culmination of more than 50 years of scientific research. So I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes recapping some of that because in my experience, many people don't actually know how really old and well-established the science behind the question of climate change is. So scientists have known that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas since the mid-19th century. In the 1850s, Irish chemist John Tyndall first established that carbon dioxide and water were greenhouse gases. And by that, we mean simply that they're highly transparent to visible light and let light in, but relatively opaque to infrared radiation and therefore trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. In the early 1900s, the Swedish geochemist Svante Arrhenius first suggested that burning fossil fuels, mainly coal at that time, could warm the planet. Arrhenius did the first calculations of what the effect of doubling carbon dioxide would be, what we now call the climate sensitivity, and calculated that it would be between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. Now, he was Swedish, so he thought global warming would be a good thing. The first person to provide empirical evidence that CO2 was actually possibly already increasing and to suggest that it might not be a good thing was the British steam engineer Guy Stewart Callendar, who in 1938 published the first peer-reviewed scientific article in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society suggesting that carbon dioxide and temperature might be increasing. So that's 1938. So scientists already had it on the table, so to speak, that there was this question about whether or not fossil fuels would increase carbon dioxide and whether or not it would cause a change in climate, and had suggested that the answer to those questions was probably yes. Now, 1939, war broke out in Europe. Callendar became busy with other things, and it's not until the 1950s that the question becomes revisited. And it's revisited in the context of the International Geophysical Year. In 1957, a group of scientists, including these two men, Hans Suess and Roger Revelle, were working on a planning committee for the IGY in which they had asked themselves the question, what kind of data should geophysicists collect during the International Geophysical Year? And one answer to that question is, well, we ought to collect data on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in order to test what they called the Callendar question. Was carbon dioxide increasing? And if so, was it changing the climate? And the answer to that question, that work, that measurement became the life's work of this man, Charles David Keeling, a professor at the University of California. In 1958, Dave Keeling began the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide as part of the International Geophysical Year. And if you ever ask yourself the question, well, why did Dave Keeling start measuring CO2? The answer is because he was trying to answer the Callendar question. That is to say, scientists already knew that climate change could occur, and the question was whether or not it was, in fact, occurring. By 1965, Dave was convinced that his own data showed that there was, in fact, a measurable increase in CO2. So when he started during the IGY, the average amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 315 parts per million, and by a few years later, by 7 years later, 65, it was up to 320. And that led Dave, along with Roger Revelle and a number of other scientists, to write a report to the President's Science Advisory Committee, in which they said, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. So that's 1965. It's often said that scientists get things wrong or that they've exaggerated, but actually the correct answer was that by the year 2000, there was actually about 30% more. So they got it approximately right, but if anything, their estimate was a little on the low side. We know that this report was read at the White House, and in the same year, later that year, President Lyndon Johnson, in a special message to Congress, said, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." Now, admittedly, in 1965, President Johnson had a few other things to worry about. He had a war in Vietnam that wasn't going very well. So we don't see a lot of serious interest generated in policy circles, although climate change does get discussed again in the Nixon administration, and it gets discussed at quite great length. I'm working on a paper right now about this. Actually, in the 1970s Stockholm Conference, the first big international conference on the environment, the U.S. sent a big delegation, and in the report from that conference, there is a discussion about carbon dioxide and climate. So it's on the radar screen, but it's not yet really getting a lot of attention. That begins to change in the 1970s. From the scientific standpoint, the big difference is the rise of numerical simulation and the building of the first general circulation models to model the atmosphere and to revisit what scientists call the Callendar question. How does increased carbon dioxide impact global climate? So by this point, scientists know that CO2 is increasing. Dave Keeling has shown that. But the answer is, okay, so what impact will this change have? And these models, these state-of-the-art models, confirm the result that Svante Arrhenius had achieved almost 100, well, 70, about 70 years ago by this point, that the climate sensitivity was probably around 2 to 3 degrees. This did lead to serious discussion and policy implications. I've already mentioned the Stockholm Conference, also the first World Climate Conference in 1976, a major report from the National Research Council in 1977, a major report for the US Department of Energy in 1979, and a major report from the National Academy of Sciences also in 79. And there were also similar reports being written in Europe and elsewhere around the time. Bert Bolin in Sweden was a major leader in conversations here in Europe. As a result of these diverse studies, the US National Academy of Sciences, in a press release in 1979, said that a plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use. In other words, there was a scientific consensus in 1979 that global warming would happen, and there was also a consensus that when it did happen, it would matter, that it would be significant. So, for example, in the United States, the Climate Research Board of the National Academy explained the close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society. And they talk about things like national security, agricultural crop failure, sea level rise, impacts on ports and trade. So all of the issues that we're talking about today, they were already aware of at that time. The area in which they did not have a consensus was when. When would these changes happen? And therefore, how urgent would it really be? In the book, we have an anecdote. We interviewed one scientist who briefed the White House in 1979, and he recalls that one White House aide said, well, when is any of this going to happen? And he said, well, our best estimate is maybe in about 40 years. And the aide said, please come back in 39 years. So obviously, we know politicians aren't very interested in things that are a long way away. But it turned out that it wasn't actually so long away. Only 6 years later, NASA climate modeler James Hansen and his team concluded that they had detected the human fingerprint in the climate system. And this is what led to his testimony in the US Congress. This result was reported on the front page of the New York Times and in newspapers around the world. And in the United States, it led to the introduction in Congress of a bill, the US National Energy Policy Act, to establish a national energy policy to reduce the generation of carbon dioxide and trace gases as quickly as is feasible in order to slow the pace and degree of atmospheric warming. So what happened? Why didn't the National Energy Policy Bill get passed? Why didn't we take those concrete steps that President Bush promised? Why didn't we act on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? The short answer to that question is that as the scientific consensus emerged and gained media and political attention, so did a politically motivated campaign to challenge that consensus. And you saw a snippet of that in the film. The campaign focused on the claim that the science was uncertain, that it was unsettled, that we didn't have a consensus, that the science was distorted, and therefore it was premature to act. Now, as historians, Eric Conway and I were interested in answering the question, well, where did these claims come from originally? Because everything has a beginning. And what we discovered was a kind of shocking discovery, was that we could trace the claim back to a small handful of people, and it wasn't the people you saw in that film. It was not the CEOs of ExxonMobil or Massey Energy. It was a group of Cold War physicists. This story has its origins in a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the George C. Marshall Institute that was founded by these three men. They were all physicists who had worked on American Cold War rocketry and weapons program. So this man, Robert Jastrow, who was the brainchild of the whole thing, was the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA. This man on the right, William Nierenberg, was a nuclear physicist who had worked on isotope separation for the Manhattan Project and the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where, full disclosure, I knew him. I also knew Jastrow, by the way. We both taught at the same university briefly early in my career. I can tell you some interesting stories about him later, if you like. And this man, the only one of the three I didn't know, but probably the most famous, Frederick Seitz, one of the most famous solid-state physicists of the 20th century, who served as president of the US National Academy of Sciences and president of the Rockefeller University. So all three extremely successful, extremely distinguished, extremely brilliant scientists. How did they become climate change deniers? Well, in the early 1980s, they were working together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration on the question of the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes known as Star Wars. As some of you may know, there was very, very deep opposition in the American scientific community to SDI. In fact, it was really the first time that the American scientific community as a whole had opposed a major weapon or rocketry program. Jastrow, Seitz, and Nirenberg supported SDI, and they were extremely upset that their scientific colleagues were speaking out in public against it. And so they created the Marshall Institute to defend SDI and to create the idea of a debate in order to say to journalists and the public, no, it's not true that scientists are all opposed to this. We support it. And so to create a debate in order to keep SDI alive. Now, what we discovered in our research was that at the same time that this was going on, Fred Seitz was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. Now, what we know from a lot of really excellent historical work that's been done by other historians of science and also from the work of lawyers who have been involved in the prosecution of the tobacco industry, that the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend its product was what we call doubt-mongering. To insist the science was unsettled, that there wasn't a consensus, to solicit experts who would argue in public that there was a big scientific debate, and therefore it would be premature for governments to act to control tobacco use. What we found was that in 1989, these two different strands came together. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union began to break apart, the Cold War ended. So you might have thought that these old Cold Warriors would be happy that they would have celebrated the end of the Cold War and the fact that the Soviet Union had collapsed and the United States was still standing. But that's not what happened. Instead, they found a new enemy, a new target, what they called environmental extremism, and what they thought was the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing agenda, people who wanted to bring socialism through the back door. And using the tools that Fred Seitz had learned working with R.J. Reynolds, they applied the tobacco strategy to insist that the science was unsettled. We now have millions of pages of documents about the tobacco industry, and one of the most telling, most famous documents of them all is the so-called Doubt is Our Product memo. So it goes like this. Doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. This and many other documents show that the tobacco industry had deliberately used the strategy of doubt-mongering to confuse people, to confuse smokers, to confuse public health officials, and keep tobacco products on the market. But what the tobacco industry also understood was that for doubt-mongering to be effective, they needed scientific experts. If a tobacco industry CEO stood up in public and said, oh, you know, lots of things cause cancer, we might be skeptical of that. We would understand that he was not objective. But if a scientist, and particularly a distinguished scientist, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences said that, well, that would be persuasive. And the media would listen, and they would quote that person in the newspaper and on television. And so they realized that having scientists was key to this strategy working. And so they recruited scientists to supply doubt, including Frederick Seitz. But what we showed in our work was that these scientists then went on to sow doubt about a whole set of other issues that had nothing to do with tobacco, including the threat of nuclear winter, the reality of acid rain, the severity and causes of the ozone hole, and then, of course, the issue we're concerned with here today, global warming. The physicists in our story cast doubt on the scientific evidence of all these different issues, but even though the issues were different, the argument and the strategy was always the same. The science is unsettled, there's no consensus. The uncertainties are very great, we can't trust models. There are many causes of the alleged phenomenon, so we don't really know what the cause is. Fixing the problem would be too expensive, kill jobs, wreck the economy. Fixing the problem would undermine personal freedom. And I should add the sixth one, and in any case, global warming is good for you. And the implicit punchline of this, which is rarely said but always implied, is that therefore nothing needs to be done. Nothing should be done. So why would these people do this? Why would they defend tobacco and all these other products that we had all this scientific evidence of the harms? Well, the best way to answer that question is to let them tell you in their own words. And for that, I'd like to introduce a fourth character in the story, also a Cold War physicist, a man by the name of S. Fred Singer. The other three are dead now, but Fred Singer is still alive. You saw him in that clip about how thick he was. He's also a very litigious man. He's threatened to sue lots of scientists, so I always make a point of saying in public what a nice, generous, and wonderful human being he is. Like the other scientists, he was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, the ozone hole, and also tobacco. As I mentioned, from 79 to 85, Fred Seitz had worked for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, and in the early 1990s, Singer worked with the Philip Morris tobacco industry to attack the American Environmental Protection Agency over the issue of the dangers of secondhand smoke. So this is in the early 1990s, and the EPA had compiled results, had done a study in order to answer the question, was secondhand smoke dangerous? And the answer to that question, they concluded unequivocally, was yes. And they declared secondhand smoke to be a Class A or proven carcinogen. This result had been affirmed by 2 different reports from the US Surgeon General, and it was based on a review by an independent expert panel of over 6,000 peer-reviewed scientific journals, with evidence from Japan, Germany, the United States, and many other countries. They concluded that secondhand smoke was responsible for more than 3,000 additional adult death cancers every year in the United States alone, and between 150 and 3,000 additional cases of bronchitis and pneumonia in infants and young children. So very serious morbidity among children and mortality among non-smoking adults. They also showed that it was correlated with an increase in sudden infant death syndrome. But Fred Singer challenged this work. In a report called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke that was wholly funded by the tobacco industry, he claimed that the EPA was wrong. Now, why would a lawyer and a rocket scientist, and I should just say, and the report was co-authored by a lawyer, a man named Kent Jeffries, who was affiliated with the Cato Institute, which is the group that made that mirror image climate report that we showed you a few minutes ago. So why would a lawyer and a rocket scientist challenge the scientific evidence of the harms of secondhand smoke? Indeed, why would they defend a product that scientific evidence showed killed children? Well, they actually answered that in their own words. They said, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there is essentially no limit to how much government can control our lives. So what we see here and elsewhere, in the book we go into much more detail about the ideological structure of their thinking, but it's not an argument about the science. It's not an argument that we need more data, although that's what they say in public. But what they say in the actual reports and in their letters to each other is this is an argument about government and governance. It's an argument against government intervention in the marketplace, an argument against regulation. And the motivating question is the question of how much government should regulate the marketplace, even to protect people from scientifically documented dangers. And their answer is that the government shouldn't, because it's a slippery slope. We let them regulate tobacco today, then there's no limit to how much they can control our lives tomorrow. In the United States, the Wall Street Journal has been a major source of challenges to climate change, climate science over the past 2 decades. It still is, even in the last few weeks, continuing to claim that there is no global warming or whatever. Frank Luntz was a major Republican advisor and pollster, and he wrote in the in the Wall Street Journal, once we concede that greenhouse gases must be controlled, it will only be a matter of time before we end up endorsing more economically damaging regulation. So it's not an argument about whether or not climate change is really happening. It's an argument about what happens once we accept the fact that greenhouse gases really do need to be controlled. Now, arguing against government regulation of the marketplace was obviously convenient for the tobacco industry, and it's obviously convenient for the fossil fuel industry as well. But it also helps to explain the origins of this story in the Cold War and the role of Cold War physicists, something that wouldn't, on the face of it, be obvious. And it also, in my opinion, and I'll get to this in a minute, it also helps to explain why these arguments have been so persuasive to so many Americans, even people who don't have stock in ExxonMobil. So if we look at the physicists in this story, we see that these men were scientists who had dedicated their lives to containing communism. That's how they understood their work in these weapons and rocketry programs. For them, defending the free market against government intrusion was an extension of that work. Their argument was that government regulation was a slippery slope to socialism, a kind of backdoor to communism. And indeed, in their writings, we frequently find them asserting that environmentalists, and by implication, scientists working on environmental issues, are socialists and communists seeking to control our lives. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. George Will, who writes for the Washington Post, generally thought to be a liberal newspaper, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots. And Senator James Inhofe, who some of you know brought a snowball to the White House last winter in order to disprove global warming, has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress and accuse them of being part of the liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I reply that liberals should be so organized. And in the last presidential election cycle, when Republican candidate Mitt Romney broke with his party and said he did believe that humans had contributed to global warming, the former Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich attacked him, saying that the push to address climate change is just the newest excuse to take control of our lives. So this issue of control kind of comes up over and over again. And most recently, in this current election cycle, all of the Republican candidates running for president, all of them, have expressed doubt about the scientific conclusions regarding man-made climate change, and the leading contender, Donald Trump, has called it the global warming hoax created by and for the Chinese. We talked at lunch about the issues of how climate change could change the power dynamics between the US and the Chinese. So even though Donald Trump says a lot of preposterous and ridiculous things, the fact that he brings up the Chinese is actually, in a way, extremely telling of what many people are really worried about in the United States, which is actually about American political power. Now, there are many obvious things wrong with these claims, and I could have a whole other lecture unpacking them, but I just want to point out one that I think is most interesting and may not be obvious, that American environmentalism is not a green tree with red roots. In fact, it doesn't even have liberal or left-wing roots at all. There was a big left-wing socialistic movement in America in the early 20th century associated with labor unions like the International Workers of the World, but that's not where environmentalism in America came from. The origins of the US environmental movement were found in the progressive republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist John D. Rockefeller. In the United States, for most of the 20th century, there was in fact a bipartisan consensus on the importance of environmental protection. Many bills were passed in Congress from the 1910s through the 1970s that passed by large bipartisan margins. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was created by Republican President Richard Nixon, who signed into law the key pieces of environmental legislation that make up the legal and regulatory framework that protects the environment in the United States today and has been a model for similar legislation in many other countries. So this includes the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the ban on DDT use in the United States. But things began to change in the 1980s when three important things happened. Well, a lot of things happened, but three that I think are most important for this story. As a historian, you're always grappling with the fact that a million things are happening at any given moment, and you're trying to sort out what you think is most relevant for the things you're trying to explain. So one of them is the presidency of Ronald Reagan. In the 1970s, the US economy, like many economies in Europe, had stalled. And in response to stalled economic growth, the Reagan administration and also the Thatcher administration in the United Kingdom began to argue very strenuously that the way to jumpstart the economy was to decrease government, decrease regulation, and free up the so-called magic of the marketplace. And their guru in this thinking was the Chicago economist Milton Friedman, who is seen here receiving the National Medal of Honor from the president. The second thing that happened, as I've already mentioned, is that the Cold War ended. And this is a little bit counterintuitive because you might have thought that with the end of the Cold War, Americans would relax and think, wow, we did well. You know, we're pretty safe, we're pretty secure, we're pretty free, and we don't have to be paranoid about containing communism. But that's not what happened. Actually, for many conservatives, the collapse of the Soviet communism was taken as a kind of vindication of free market capitalism and proof of the linkage that they saw between free market economics and personal freedom. And they began to argue the slogan, capitalism is freedom, and to argue that if capitalism is the best system, then the best form of capitalism is its purest form, that is to say, its most unregulated form. And so they began to push what we would now call a neoliberal agenda to deregulate the marketplace in order to maximize personal individual freedom. And the third thing, and this is an example of what we historians would call a contingency, it just happened to occur at the same time, but it really mattered that these things happened at the same time. The evidence of acid rain, ozone hole, and man-made climate change began to coalesce. So the end of the Cold War and the rise of Reagan neoliberal policies hit at exactly the moment that scientists are starting to say, we have a problem with acid rain, we have a problem with ozone depletion, we have a problem with climate change. And these problems all seem to demonstrate the need for more government involvement in the marketplace, not less. And that puts scientific evidence on a collision course with conservative thinking in America, a collision course on which we are still traveling. Because admitting the effects of climate change, like the reality of the effects of tobacco use, meant admitting the reality of market failure. It meant acknowledging the reality of what economists call external costs, sometimes also called negative externalities, the price of doing business or using a product like tobacco or like fossil fuels, prices and costs that are not adequately addressed by market economics, and costs that governance is needed to remedy market failure. And this, when we were writing the book, you know, when we started this book, we had this feeling like, well, what do these things have in common? What does tobacco have to do with climate change? But this is the answer, that the common thread that unites these otherwise diverse issues is that they're all market failures. Indeed, Nicholas Stern, in the Stern Report for the United Kingdom government, in which they calculated the external cost of carbon at trillions of dollars, Lord Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank, called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. That is to say, we often think about climate change as a scientific problem, but what Nick Stern did so effectively was to re-articulate it as an economic problem. And how do you remedy a market failure? Well, you remedy with an intervention in the marketplace, an intervention that originates outside the market. And if you ask yourself, well, how did we address these earlier problems? They all involved appropriate government interventions. So in the case of DDT in the United States, its use was banned. If we look at acid rain, it was solved primarily through emissions trading systems, and here in Europe through transboundary conventions controlling the sources of acid rain. The ozone hole was solved through an international treaty that banned the chemicals that cause ozone depletion. And tobacco has been addressed through a whole mix of different policy instruments that include civil and federal prosecution, bans on smoking in public places and aircrafts, and heavy taxation to discourage its use. These policy instruments all worked. We addressed these various problems and to a large degree solved them with government interventions. And we did not find ourselves living in a Soviet-style dictatorship. But we did find ourselves expanding the role of government in the marketplace and agreeing to new forms of regulation, new restrictions on the marketplace, and new forms of governments like the Montreal Protocol. And this, I think, helps to explain the persistence of the American denial of climate change. Because Americans, far more than Europeans or others around the world, subscribe deeply to a belief in laissez-faire economics. America as a country was created by men who lionized individual liberty, were suspicious of political authority, and argued famously that the government that governs best governs least. Another way of thinking about this is that climate denial can be thought of as implicatory denial. The merchants of doubt denied the reality of a set of problems because they disliked the character of the solutions. That is to say, they didn't like the solutions, more governments, more intervention in the marketplace, so they denied the reality of the problems that seemed to imply the need for those solutions. The implication was that we needed to expand government and increase government control on the marketplace, and that's an implication that they didn't like. And this also explains the particular hostility of the Republican Party to accepting climate science, because the heroes of the American right today were the economists who equated capitalism with individual freedom. And this predates the climate change problem. So if you read right-wing literature in the United States, if you listen to right-wing radio or television, which I did a lot of when I was writing Merchants of Doubt, they have two heroes. They have two books they cite all the time, although I doubt they actually read them. But one of them is Friedrich von Hayek's classic work, The Road to Freedom, and the other is Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. I already mentioned Friedman, but if you read the introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, how many people here have ever read one, either or both of these books? Couple, okay. Well, if you haven't, you need to read these, because if you really are committed to sustainability, you need to understand the framework and the thinking of people who oppose sustainability, because on some level, I'm sure you've had the thought sometimes, well, why would anybody oppose sustainability? Like, why? How could you not be in favor of sustainability? But this is the answer. So Friedman acknowledges his debt to von Hayek. So what is the argument here? Both Friedman and von Hayek were economists, but the argument of these books is not primarily an economic argument. It's not primarily an argument in defense of free market capitalism as an efficient means to deliver goods and services, much less a discussion of supply and demand or any of the other things that we think of as basic economic questions. It's a political argument about freedom, that capitalism and freedom are linked, and if we want to preserve political freedom, we have to preserve economic freedom. And here's how the argument goes. The argument is that the free market is a form of distributed political power. That in a free market economy, various individuals make their choices every day, and in making those free choices, they hold power in their hands, and they prevent its concentration in centralized government. But on the other hand, conversely, if you have a centrally planned economy, as in the Soviet Union, that entails not just the concentration of economic power, but of political power as well, because you can't control the economy unless you control the people, the employers, the employees, the distributors, and everyone else in that system. So centralized economic planning necessarily leads to a loss of political and personal freedom. And therefore, they argue the free market and free market economics is a bulwark against totalitarianism. So Friedrich von Hayek in The Road to Serfdom in 1944 famously wrote, this is a very often quoted line, "The unforeseen but inevitable consequence of socialist planning is to create a state of affairs in which, if the policy is pursued, totalitarian forces will get the upper hand." And so you see it's a slippery slope argument. If you allow the government to begin to engage in centralized planning, it's only a matter of time before we will end up in a totalitarian situation. Bruce Caldwell gives a very good introduction to von Hayek in the 2007 edition, and he writes, von Hayek believed that requires that the planning authorities take over all production decisions. To be able to make any decisions at all, they would need to exercise more and more political control. If one tries to create a truly planned economy, one will not be able to separate control of the economy from political control. And even though that may seem like a very outdated way of thinking, because not too many people today advocate Soviet-style centralized planning, this argument is taken very, very seriously in American conservative political thinking. And you might say that they're overreacting or they're reacting to something that doesn't even really exist. But if you read some people, like, I don't know, Naomi Klein, for example, you might realize that maybe some people do think we ought to have centralized planning in order to address climate change. So it's not insane. It's extreme, but it's not insane. Okay, this also explains the origin of the story then in the Cold War, because then we can begin to see how this became a Cold War argument. In the Cold War, some of von Hayek's concerns took on a certain resonance as the Soviet Union did indeed strip its citizens of political and economic freedom. And the American right wing persuaded itself that the Cold War wasn't just a fight to contain communism in Europe, but really a fight to preserve the American way of life. And for Jastrow, Seitz, Nuremberg, and their colleagues, the Cold War was fought out not only in the realm of nuclear weapons and strategic defense, but also in the realm of domestic governments, in the realm of anti-communism and then later neoliberalism at home. And just to give you one example of this thinking and how these people thought about their own work. So in 1984, when they were creating the Marshall Institute, Bill Nierenberg corresponded with Lieutenant General Daniel O. Graham, who was the originator of the concept of what they called the high frontier, the idea of having space-based weapons program, which later became the foundation of a whole lot of, well, the whole Star Wars movie series. So he wrote a letter to Bill Nierenberg asking him to join in the defense of SDI. And when he wrote, he said that he felt this was their chance to recapitulate the work of the founding fathers and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, of course, there is one more component to this story, as you saw in the film clip, and that's the role of the corporate sector. Companies like Peabody Energy, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and others. What we found in our research was that climate change denial actually originates in right-wing think tanks before the fossil fuel industry gets involved. But then, of course, they do become involved, and they become the major funders of these think tanks that are promoting climate change denial. So we see a confluence of interest between the economic interest of the fossil fuel industry and the ideological interests of these old cold warriors. And this continues to the present day. So this is a little diagram that I put together showing where things stood in 2014. Today, ExxonMobil doesn't say publicly that they deny climate change. In fact, in public, they say that they accept it, as does Shell, BP, Chevron, and most of the other major organizations. And yet, they're actually all still members of trade organizations like the American Petroleum Institute or the Western States Petroleum Association or a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council. These groups all do still actively deny climate change. So through these allies, through these third parties, they funnel money to continue climate change denial, even while in public or on their websites they claim that they don't. Now, it turns out there's a long history in the United States of the private sector claiming that government interventions in the market threaten our personal freedom. And I've come to believe that we really have to understand this history better if we're going to unpack climate change denial. And I found a very interesting advertising campaign from the early 1960s that was run under the headline, "How is Freedom Lost?" So this particular advertisement was run in 1961, I think it was. And as you can see, it's probably a picture of the Berlin Wall, and you can see the sad-faced young man behind the barbed wire. What do you imagine this is an advertisement for? If you had to guess, what would you think this is advertising? Don't you answer, I told you. So one side did this, somebody said barbed wire, another person said hats. It's an advertisement for electricity, for private sector electricity. In the early 1960s, the US government was expanding its program of building hydroelectric dams in the western United States. And privately generated electrical utilities opposed it because they didn't want the government undercutting them in the marketplace. But instead of making the argument for the pros and cons of private sector electricity or making the argument that they could make it more efficiently or arguing that dams were a bad idea because they destroyed habitat, they made the argument that if we allowed the government to generate electricity, we would end up living in an Eastern German type totalitarian society. So it's the same argument again. Today the government intervenes in the marketplace. Tomorrow we live under communist-style totalitarianism. So as a historian, when I discover old roots of things, I get really excited because it makes me feel like I'm a real historian, especially since, as Ulla mentioned, I was trained originally as a geologist, so I sometimes feel a little insecure about my historical bona fides. But on the other hand, the deeper the problem goes historically, then you realize the harder it's going to be to fix, right? I mean, to understand that this is a problem that is at least a century old makes us realize that it's going to be extremely difficult to fix. Because if there's anything that history does demonstrate, it's that historical legacies run deep. So I don't have a real answer to this, but I have a few ideas that I'd like to end with, and then we can open this up for discussion. I do think that it may help for Europeans to understand that many Americans are going to be suspicious of any solution that expands government power, like, for example, binding emissions reductions under Kyoto. So in hindsight, we could say that In hindsight, it's obvious that Kyoto would have been upsetting to conservatives in the United States, and in hindsight, maybe it wasn't the best way to go, although we can understand why it seemed like a good idea at the time. But going forward, I would say that the new approach in Paris actually makes a lot of sense, that it makes sense to understand that different countries are going to have to address this issue in different ways, and some countries may be much more comfortable with centralized government approaches than the United States will be. In America, I believe people are more likely to be sympathetic to market-based solutions like carbon pricing, although we'll see. So I think that to the extent that market-based mechanisms can work, we should try to prioritize them where we can. But at the same time, we have to reject the deification of the free market and the demonization of government. I think that a lot of people on the left in the United States have been kind of intimidated by free market rhetoric, so much so that they've gone along with free market arguments even when they don't work and they don't make sense. And they've gone along with the false equation of capitalism and freedom, because that's just not true. And we can come up with lots and lots of examples from history, both recent and older, to show that there is no necessary linkage between capitalism and freedom. There may be a necessary linkage between centralized economies and a lack of freedom, but the reverse is not true. And just to give you three obvious examples, think about Chile under General Pinochet. It was a capitalistic country and it was a dictatorship, a brutal one. In China today, there's some form of economics that economists don't even really know what to call it, but some are beginning to call it market authoritarianism. It's not a democracy, but it is increasingly moving in the direction of market-based principles. And of course, the most obvious example is the United States, which has always been a capitalistic country since its inception, and for a century had slavery. We have to remind ourselves as well, and our fellow citizens, that the raison d'etre of government is to balance competing interests and competing interpretations of freedom. But most of all, that freedom is not protected by our forms of distributing goods and services, but by our forms of governance, by our laws, and our civic norms. And in thinking about this, I've been quite influenced of late by historian Timothy Snyder in his recent book, Black Earth. Have any of you read or heard of this book? It's a new book about the Holocaust. Yeah, if you have a chance to read it, when the book first came out and I was sent it to review, I thought, really, another book on the Holocaust? You know, but honestly, this is a very remarkable book, and I really recommend that you read it. One of the central arguments of Professor Snyder's work is that if you look at the question of how the final solution was implemented, what you see is that one of the first steps that the Nazis took in occupied Eastern European countries was to dismantle civic authority and the normal protections, civil protections of citizens, to strip people of citizenship. And in fact, he argues that one of the reasons that they were able to do it was that many forms of a civic authority had already been at least partially dismantled or damaged by the prior Soviet occupation. And it was this dismantling of civic authority and the rights of citizenship that paved the way for the final solution. And he has a long and detailed argument of this, and I can't do it justice here, but that's the essential point. And he sees in this a lesson for our own times, noting that a common American error is to believe that freedom is the absence of state authority. State authority, of course, can be abused, but its absence does not lead to liberty. On the contrary, the history of the Holocaust suggests that it was the dismantling of civic norms and conventional forms of government that led to the disaster that we call the Holocaust. Or another way of putting it more pithily, as the philosopher Isaiah Berlin once said, liberty for wolves is death to the lambs. And I believe that as disruptive climate change unfolds, it won't just be the lambs that get hurt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this great and thought-provoking talk. Worrying too. We knew, of course, that this would be very inspiring and very important, so we have no enlisted discussions. We thought it wouldn't be necessary and it wouldn't be fair to block you all from getting a chance to engage right away. So it's free now for each of you to ask questions as you about the issues you want. There will be microphones running around, and that's pretty important because even if we can actually hear each other, it doesn't matter because it has to be recorded for the TV or the video recording. So wait for the microphone. I don't know, do you have any preference? Should we take one by one or three in a row?
Sure, we can do them one by one.
I think one by one
yeah.
is actually better. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. David Miller. Just a few points. I agree with you what you say, by the way, so that's good.
Thank you.
I should have brought my book so you could sign it. There are a few other things you didn't mention, though. You did mention that the oil industry was behind those think tanks, funding the think tanks, but actually the oil industry is also interested in their profits. You didn't really mention the profit motive. I mean, you mentioned the ideological one of those, those former Cold War scientists, but you didn't really talk about like why, ExxonMobil and the other ones are really interested in continuing selling fossil fuel. And then the other issue about it being a slippery slope with government control, but what we're seeing now in the U.S. with the Republican Party is that they want to control women's bodies, for instance. Right. They want to control immigrants. They want to control a lot of people, actually. Maybe you can address that in future presentation. Doesn't have to be today. Sure. And there's also George Lakoff, I assume you're familiar with, and maybe some of the more deeper reasons why Republicans and also these Cold War scientists believe what they believe in terms of maybe a strict father upbringing and how, humans can't, it's nature and it's God and all this other stuff, and humans can't do these other things. But now, my other question, or maybe you can address this, now with Bernie Sanders and the talk of democratic socialism and that becoming more acceptable in the United States, do you feel that, and we've seen, for instance, that ExxonMobil and others, as in one of your last slides, that now even the oil companies are admitting that humans cause, climate change. Do you feel that one of the reasons, and you showed in your graph too, that there's more now, even Republicans that believe that climate change is happening, that it's going to dissipate even more, this denial, because an acceptance of the values of, let's say, democratic socialism, in other words, that the government does have a positive role to play in society?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Those are all great points. I'll try to answer them briefly since there's a lot there. I'll take the last one first. I mean, I do think the pendulum might be starting to shift, which is one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to have a robust conversation about what is the role of governance in society? Why do we have government? And how do we balance competing interests? Those are real issues, and we ought to be having that conversation, so I'm hoping to try to get people to have it. When I first heard Bernie Sanders say that he was a democratic socialist, I almost died, because I thought, oh my God, this is opening up, he's opening himself up to some unbelievable opportunities for red baiting and, accusing him of being a Marxist-Leninist and all of that sort of thing. So it is interesting that that hasn't happened yet. I think it's partly because the Republicans have been so busy fighting among themselves. I think that if Sanders were to become the nominee, which it doesn't look like that will happen, but if he were, I think he would be crushed in a general election, and it would be only a matter of minutes before the Republicans would pull out clips of him talking about how he liked the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and that would be the end of it. So I don't think America's really ready for democratic socialism yet, but I might be wrong. The very fact that he felt he could say that at all is really interesting. I mean, it is the first time since the 1950s that we've had a major political candidate who has said in public that he is a socialist. I also find it very interesting that he's also Jewish, but he does not say he's Jewish in public. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that his calculus is that it's more acceptable in America. America's more ready for a socialist president than is ready for a Jewish president, in my opinion, which I find very interesting. He may well be right about that. I don't know. On the subject of profits, yes, of course. I mean, ultimately for ExxonMobil, as the tobacco industry beforehand, this is about protecting one of the most profitable industries in the history of mankind. We didn't write that book because, frankly, we thought it was totally obvious. And we thought if we wrote that book, people would say, well, that is completely obvious. What we thought was less obvious was why that argument resonated. We were trying to understand not why does Lee Raymond defend fossil fuels, that's obvious, but why do ordinary Americans buy into it? And why has the Republican Party bought into it? And why would a group of distinguished physicists who, I mean, we spent a lot of time in the archives with Bill Nierenberg's paper, Bob Jastrow's papers. They didn't have any particular link to the fossil fuel industry. This was not about protecting fossil fuel profits for them. And I think the reason this has been so powerful is because it's not just about profits. It's about a kind of confluence of money, power, and ideology. And I think when money, power, and ideology line up, And when you can persuade American people that their most deeply held values about personal freedom and liberty are at stake, that's a really powerful message. And that's going to resonate with a lot of people in North Dakota and Kentucky and Florida and even Massachusetts in a way that if we said, oh yeah, well, ExxonMobil deserves to make a lot of profits. So I think that's the crux of the story. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure a lot of other people have questions.
So, Mina, okay, thank you. My name is Thomas Meyer Larsen, and just a few comments, conflict of interest. I'm an associate professor at the university. I'm also a member of the Danish climate movement, and we are now recently become affiliated with the 350 organization. So a couple of questions. We are in Denmark, and one of the most prominent, say, climate deniers, at least in the beginning, was Bjørn Lomborg. Just curious if you have some interesting information on him and your interpretation. And then second, this is more kind of a strategic question that you mentioned Naomi Klein. And is that of benefit for the 350 organization that she's becoming more and more, or at least somewhat, affiliated with this organization, mentioning the things that you've said so far? Thank you.
Thank you. The first question I called the Lomborg question. I've been to Denmark a few times now, and it always starts with, well, because we're here in Denmark. So yes, I've had some interactions with Bjørn Lomborg. You know, there are lots of different reasons people can be motivated to become involved in these kinds of activities. And I do think that the American story is distinctively American, and I don't think that it explains climate denial in Denmark or France or other places to the extent that it exists. It helps explain why there's so much more of it in the United States. Some people who get involved in climate change denial, I think, do it in part because they get so much attention for doing it. You know, if a scientist comes along and says, yes, I agree, climate change is real, scientists are right about this, let's work on solutions, chances are they don't really get wined and dined, they don't get invited to the Cato Institute. But if they do say those things, I mean, the right wing in the United States has been very, very effective at identifying people like Bjørn Lomborg. He's not the only one. There are people in Australia, this guy Bill Carter, Ian Plimer. They invite these people, they promote them to the press. And Lomborg was particularly effective because he had this story about how he used to be an environmentalist and then saw the light, and he's good looking, and he's, you know, better looking than these Australian guys they trot out. You know, so he had a certain media presence, and he's very media savvy. You know, what I generally say when I get asked about him in the United States is he's entitled to his opinion, but most people who have studied this issue don't share it. You know, and that's kind of the bottom line. About Naomi Klein, you know, this is a very tricky question. It's partly a question about social movements. When I first heard her speaking on the radio, I have to say my heart sank because I felt that what she was saying, if Bill Nierenberg had been alive, he would have hit me on the shoulder and said, see, I told you, this is an excuse to bring in socialism by the back door, you know? And in a way, she confirmed what he believed, right? She said, I realized these guys were right, that actually the problem is capitalism, and therefore we do have to dismantle capitalism, right? So then people on the right would see that as affirmation of their fears. So that makes it tricky, right? Because I don't want to be in a position of saying that anybody shouldn't speak truly and authentically about what they think. And maybe she's right. I mean, maybe this problem really cannot be fixed by capitalism as we know it. But my response to that as a historian is to say that I think the word capitalism is too coarse. That capitalism isn't one thing. It hasn't been one thing in history. It hasn't been one thing. It's not the same in Denmark as it is in the United States, right? We have a lot of different forms of capitalism. I think the problem is this sort of extreme, deregulated, neoliberal capitalism that has been dominant on the world scene since, you know, the Thatcher-Reagan period. I think there are a lot of things we could do, short of dismantling global capitalism, that could go a very, very long way towards solving this problem. And without, you know, we were talking at lunch about sustainable politics, right? We want a sustainable economy, a sustainable energy system, but we also need politics that we can sustain. I might be wrong. It might be that Bernie Sanders does represent, you know, that he is the vanguard of something really new and different, and it may be that not long from now we will have a socialist system in the United States, but I can't see it. I don't think any of the evidence supports that hypothesis, and I think all the evidence cuts the other way, that if we're going to make any progress on this issue at all, we've got to join forces with people who we might disagree with on a lot of other issues. And so my view is to say, we should try to fix this problem as much as we can with moderate reforms of capitalism, forms of reform that are actually acceptable to a lot of conservatives, like carbon pricing. And if 10 and 15 years from now we find we really are not making the progress we need, then maybe we might get more radical. Now, I mean, Naomi Klein would probably say, but that already happened. We already tried that, and that's where we are now. So I respect that argument. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I just, you know, it doesn't resonate for me. So should 350 be closely associated with those? You know, that's a really tough question. I don't know that I think that's a bigger question than I'm prepared to answer. At least until we have a beer or something.
My name is Amelia, and I'm a master's student here at the University of Copenhagen. And I've seen your movie, and during that time, it really resonated with me. And as a student who I have a background in political science, and now I'm doing a scientific study, I really try to ask myself, how can I be an effective agent of change? And I'm wondering, because I've really gotten very interested in the issue of climate change communication, and realizing, you know, that it's a situation, particularly in the United States, that the framing of this issue is being dominated by a minority voice that that is not necessarily telling the truth. I'm wondering, what would that new narrative look like, and how? Because it also is, you know, you see a lot of it is this call to scientists that's like, you need to step up, you need to, but, you know, be putting yourself out there and defending the science, but that's very difficult for scientists themselves to do. And so I didn't know if there was a chance for students, even though we don't really have much credibility, but if there is something that we can do, and also what that narrative or language would look like that we could try to employ. Thank you.
Great question, thank you. Well, first of all, I think young people have tremendous credibility because fundamentally this is your issue. I think one of the reasons, there are many, many reasons why scientists have had trouble communicating on this issue. It's very overdetermined. But one of the reasons is because ultimately, I think for people to speak with authenticity and credibility and conviction, they have to have skin in the game. And the weird thing about climate scientists is that in some ways they do, because they've done all this work and they want the world to listen to what they've done. But in some ways they don't, because the real consequences of this are going to play out, you know, in a really serious way from here out for the next 50 years and beyond, right? And that's why in our film, you know, Jim Hansen, I mean, he always talks about his grandchildren now. Although, frankly, I think that's a totally wrong framing. I think when you talk about your grandchildren, you imply that this issue is far in the future, as opposed to it being right here, right now. But that's why I think young people come in. This is right here and right now for you. This is your life. You know, Jim Hansen is going to be dead when Antarctica starts to break apart. I probably will be dead as well, but you might not be. And your children almost certainly won't be, right? I mean, we've got pretty good evidence now that Antarctica is already starting to destabilize. So within the next 100 years, some pretty bad stuff is likely to go down. So I think young people have tremendous credibility because you're really talking about your life. And so I think you guys should grab hold of this narrative. I think that, and we talked about this at lunch too, it's really hard to know, you know, what the new narrative needs to be, but I think it's something like, this isn't a scientific question anymore, right? We need to shift the focus away from the science and frankly away from scientists who, as you said, are generally not very good communicators for all kinds of reasons, many of which are completely legitimate. I mean, they're busy doing science, right? They're not trained to communicate. I think we need to begin to say, okay, we get it. You know, we've had 50 years of great science, loud and clear. This is now a political and economic and social question. It's about how we generate energy, how we organize our economy, how we don't pay the true cost of not just carbon, but we don't pay the external costs of lots of products, right? I mean, Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Institute is very articulate on this. And it's about how we live, right? It's about the massive waste and inefficiency, again, not just in energy, but in all our economic systems, right? Stuart Wallace, the New Economics Foundation, I think, has some good messaging on that. So it's really about saying climate change is not a scientific issue, it's an economic, political, and social issue, and let's get down to really talking about the economics. And then it shifts the conversation ways. So that, if I had to place my money, that's what I would say. But the reality is we don't know, and sometimes you just have to try things and see what happens. Because, you know, I wrote The Collapse of Western Civilization for a couple of different reasons, but one of those reasons was that I was stuck in Perth, Australia, which is in fact a quite boring place, and it rained every day for 2 weeks. And I started thinking about a future in which we have many more heavy precipitation events, which is one of the strong predictions of climate models. And I started imagining what would it be like to live in a world where it rained all the time. And that's a quite depressing thought. And the original, that book had a couple of different attempts at the introduction, but the first introduction was the historian living in the future, and it was raining every day. And I just started, and then I started writing. And when I finished, I wrote the first draft by myself. I called Eric Conway and I said, Eric, I've written something kind of weird. I don't know if it's any good. It might be totally off the wall. You might not want to have anything to do with it, but it's based on a conversation we've been having. And I said, you know, take a look. If you want to be a co-author, great. If you don't want to have anything to do with it, that's fine. And he read it. He goes, no, it's good. I'll work with you on this. And then we worked together to, you know, revise it and stuff. And now it's been translated into 11 languages and sold, in English alone, it sold over 40,000 copies for a book that took me 2 weeks to write the first draft. Right. So the answer is you just never know what's going to work. And then other things I've worked on, now I'm also now finishing a book I've been working on for 15 years, and it may turn out to be a total flop, in which case I'll never spend 15 years on a book again. But I'll probably never spend 15 years on a book again anyway. But you know, the point is, you don't know. So sometimes you also have to just try things and see what works, and not be too hung up by what academic studies of framing tell you.
Firstly, thank you for your time. My name is Guilherme, I'm from Brazil, and I currently study global nutrition and health in Metropole. And I would like to hear your thoughts about animal husbandry and the effect in climate change. And recently, there was a proposal put forward by the Danish Council of Ethics considering taxing meat to help combat climate change. I would like to hear your thoughts on that, if it's feasible around the globe.
Thank you for that question. So I have to first of all apologize and say, I really don't know that much about the agricultural, biological aspects of this issue. I came at climate change, like a lot of scientists, out of a physical science background. But you are absolutely right. I think the animal husbandry and agricultural aspects of this issue are huge. And I think as part of what you were asking about changing the narrative, focusing more attention on that, I think, is a really great idea. Because food touches everyone. And it's also something we have more control of. Like I often say, you know, I can change my light bulbs, but I can't change my electricity grid, right? But you can change what you eat starting tomorrow. And it's not a coincidence that our film was produced by Robbie Kenner, who's the filmmaker who made the film Food, Inc., which is about food systems. And Robbie got interested in climate partly because of making the movie Food, Inc., which was not about climate, it was about food in terms of sustainability, pesticides, things like that. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it to you. But we do know that about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions are associated with agriculture, deforestation, and land use changes. The lion's share of the attention has really been on greenhouse gases related to energy use for a couple of different reasons, but I think mainly, again, because most of the people who started working on this issue initially were physical scientists who were thinking about the physical systems, although, you know, deforestation has got a certain amount of attention. So I think that 40% is hugely important. I think people can feel very empowered over the agriculture and food issues. And I think the idea of a tax on meat is fabulous because it would remind people that this issue of external cost is not just about carbon. We've been talking a lot about the social cost of carbon, and that's fine. It's a good phrase because people kind of get what it means, and people understand it better than talking about negative externalities. But the reality is there are social costs of a lot of things, and there is a social cost to meat too. And we know from the tobacco experience that taxes are very effective. They work. People are affected by the price of things, of course. Hello, right? That's economics 101. And so a tax sends a signal, right? It's sending a price signal about the true cost of a product. So I think it's a great idea, and I would join a movement to support meat taxation tomorrow. So tell me where I can sign up.
Thanks a lot. I've managed to squeeze myself in on the list here. If I could ask just two questions. One is that I think this was a great explanation of, in a sense, the American exceptionalism in this. I think it's important to get at that because for many reasons America is quite important with political influence, and it is an important case in this. But I wonder if you could give some more explanation also for the kind of general level, because what is puzzling is that the level of climate denial is much higher in the US than everywhere else, but it's high everywhere in some sense, because in some sense our kind of immediate expectation should be, if there's a 90% consensus or whatever among the relevant scientists, well, wouldn't we expect that we trust our experts? We do when we go to the doctor and somewhere else. I mean, so why is there also the quite high level in all the other places where we don't have this mechanism in play? So that's my first question, is really, what are the general mechanisms relating to science, to peculiarities of the issue, whatever makes for general climate change denial in cases where we don't have the same mobilization as we have in the US? Is the spillover from the US to everywhere else, or is it because there are some other mechanism? And then something a little more closely linked to my own field of security and how we deal with big dangers and so on. How do you imagine the dynamics of this whole field in the future if we get kind of manifest, irrefutable evidence, like the Antarctica example you just gave? I mean, television-friendly events that really demonstrate to everyone this is happening, and people start turning on their politicians and say, why didn't you do anything? It's not everywhere. Is there a tipping point? Is there a process? And how would that look? What kind of political dynamics will come out of these circles in that new setting?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. I'll take the second one first. That's my want. In a way, the second one is easier because I think that history shows there is no irrefutable evidence. You know, we'd like to believe it's the whole Baconian notion of the crucial experiment, but it doesn't really exist because evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we judge evidence in this larger socio-political context. So I think a lot of people thought when Hurricane Katrina hit that was going to be a moment, but what happened in the United States was that the denial movement pulled out all the stops, ran these absolutely, horrible attacks on scientists, and really intimidated the environmental movement who were making the link between Katrina and climate change, and then the environmentalists got all intimidated and stopped and said, oh, you're right, we can't say that, blah, blah, blah. And I think that was a huge error on the part of environmentalists at that time. So, and I mean, I think the most obvious example of the non-existence of irrefutable evidence is the Titanic. I mean, eventually it became irrefutable, but then the iceberg is staring you in the face, and by then it's too late. And that's the disaster scenario, right? There is this moment of recognition, and you're right. I mean, if there were a big Antarctic ice loss or a big Greenland loss, and we saw, let's say 0.5 meter of sea level rise in a week, a lot of people would stand up and take notice, but by then it's very late, right, at that point. So this is why this problem is so troublesome, because things that you might have thought would have caused people to wake up don't seem to have done that. That relates to your first question, right, which is the question of the relationship between evidence and knowledge and action, right? And in a way, this is the fundamental problem of science and again, it brings us back to Francis Bacon. So the myth, the dream, the conceit of science, the Baconian conceit, is that knowledge is power. That if we know these things, we will act on them, and therefore we will be powerful in the world. Well, I have come to the conclusion that that's just wrong, that knowledge isn't power. Knowledge is knowledge, and power is power, and sometimes they work together, and sometimes they don't. And we live in a world where scientists actually have very little power, right? Power resides in a lot of places in modern society, and in general, the scientific community is actually not one of them. And actually, many scientists feel quite powerless. There's a scene in the film where Jim Hansen, towards the end of the film, says, we should be banging on the president's door and demanding he take action. And I remember when I saw that clip, because I wasn't there when Robbie did the interview, I remember thinking, well, I mean, this shows this man has no understanding of politics, right? The idea that that's how it works, that me, famous scientist, bangs on the president's door, and that makes a giant social change happen. No, I mean, that's not how things work. So I think scientists are actually quite powerless. They feel quite powerless, and they don't understand what real power looks like or what real social movements look like. And most scientists don't want to get involved in a social movement because that would be political, and they see that as compromising their intellectual objectivity. So they're kind of stuck in a bind there. But the reality is there's all kinds of things we know that we don't act on for all kinds of reasons. So yes, we acted on tobacco, and it's often held up as a success story, but it took 50 years from the time that the industry itself acknowledged the evidence that tobacco tars cause cancer to when the United States government finally authorized the US Federal and Drug Administration to regulate tobacco as an addictive drug, which it is. And if you take seriously the work of German historians who have worked on the German research on smoking and cancer from the 1930s, how many of you know about that? Yeah, this is a really interesting story. So German scientists knew that smoking caused cancer in the 1930s. The Nazis had a big anti-smoking campaign, and Hitler would not let people smoke in his presence. When I teach this to my students, they get really upset, right? Because they want the Nazis to be all evil. They want evil to be unalloyed, and they want good to be unalloyed, and it's always disturbing when you discover it's more complicated. So the Nazis were right about smoking. It's the one thing we can acknowledge. They were also right about brown bread. So, and Hitler was a vegetarian too, I hate to say. So, but that's okay. You know, even the worst people make some good choices. He also had a dog, you know. Okay, so if you take the Nazi work seriously, so that work got completely buried and discredited because it was Nazi science, but it turned out it was actually correct, and it's been resurrected by some historians who have been interested in this. So if you take that work seriously, then we have 60 years of scientific information before we actually act on it, right? That's a long road. And that's one of the problems about climate change, right? During the 60 years that we didn't act on tobacco, millions of people died from preventable tobacco-related diseases. So does that mean we have to get to the point where millions of people die from preventable climate-related disasters? Well, hopefully not, but that's the reality we face, right? And I think in our generation, some of us got lulled by the success of the Montreal Protocol. That was a successful example of scientists articulating scientific information and the world acting in a pretty brisk way and avoiding a very serious potential disaster. So we had that as a model, and we thought we could use that model for climate change. And the UN Framework Convention was very much modeled on the Vienna Convention, and the Kyoto Protocol was modeled to a strong extent on the Montreal Protocol, but it didn't work. In hindsight, I think we'd say that the ozone story is kind of the exception, not the rule.
I think we have one over here first.
Okay, I think we'll take then. Maybe can we take maybe three quick questions, and then you round it off.
This gentleman in green has had his hand up as well.
Yeah,
so, yeah. Okay, good.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kelvin Mlenga. I'm from Zambia. I've got a question. Just I want to know your opinion on the notion of circular economy. They're saying it can be the key element to adopt for world leaders to confront climate change.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting. I think that was what I was referring to earlier about a new narrative that includes that. We could begin to ask more questions about why do we assume that so many things have to be thrown away, and why do we have an economy that's based on waste, which it is, and could we begin to imagine an economy? So the circular economy is one of the interesting ideas that people have begun to talk about. It doesn't seem that too many mainstream economists are talking about it a lot yet, but I definitely think it's something we should be talking about more and really asking the question, why not? I mean, what's standing in the way of having an economy based much more on reusing materials instead of just discarding them? So, thank you.
I think we have two more here, so you and then you.
My name is Thomas Winge. I'm an author here in Denmark, and I write on climate change. Thank you for a very interesting lecture and a very good book. It's a page turner.
It is a page turner.
I can subscribe to that. Yes. You said one thing that the deniers, they like to recycle their way of using arguments and strategies, but they are smart. So I wonder, what should we suspect, or what should we see today from their perspective of new strategies and new arguments that we should look out for?
Yeah, great question. So I think two arguments for sure that we're going to see. We're going to see, I predict, a revival of the argument that it's too expensive to fix. And then a related one that's already on the horizon is that renewable energy isn't reliable enough. It's too intermittent. It can't be counted on. Therefore, we have to have gas into the foreseeable future to support renewable. And that argument's already out there. And if you haven't seen it, go on the internet, go to YouTube and Google Shell advertisement weak renewable energy, or I think it's something like that, some set of words like that, and it's a profoundly offensive advertisement. Has anyone seen this ad? Yeah. Okay, so it was run in France, but there's an English language translation on the internet, and it's a picture of a man and a woman sitting in a cafe, a young couple, very attractive, and the woman is very slender and graceful, and they're chatting, and then the voiceover says, she's renewable energy, she's lovely and attractive, but she's not reliable. She needs the strong hand of gas to support her, and then they at the end of this thing, they hold hands and they walk off into the sunset together. Right, so that's the message. Renewable energy is okay. It's good. You'd like to have it in your life like a woman, but you can't count on it, you know.
Okay. Last question.
Jesper Teilgaard, I'm from a Danish television, and I've been dealing with climate communication in 20 years. It's my experience that people don't understand the science. It's very difficult. But at the moment when something happens, the weather will be too strong. We have seen with the rain situations here in Denmark with flooding. People then understand something is wrong. Is that the same situation in the US? Because there's a lot of odd weather in the US
Yes.
for the last years.
Yes.
So will that change the situation in the US? And then the second question, if possibly, a Republican will take seat in the White House, yes. Will that mean, you were talking about the political system, will that mean that some of the progress Obama has made in the climate situation, will that be withdrawn? Is that possible?
Yeah.
And is it possible that the Paris Declaration will not be ratified?
Yes. So on the first question first, this time I will ask, absolutely about the extreme weather. There's no question that when we have an extreme event, people get it, as you say, that something's not right, something's weird, something's different. And this gets back to your question about communication and what scientists can do. In the United States, scientists have been supremely unhelpful on this issue, to the point that there have been times when I just want to hit some of my scientific colleagues, because we get these extreme weather events, people say, oh my gosh, something's happening, and then the scientists say, oh, well, but no one event can be attributed, blah, 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 and they completely miss this tremendous opportunity. So there are people in the States who've been trying to work with scientists on this. Susan Joy Hassel is very good on this issue. You could look up her website if you're interested, and she's been working, and then the National Research Council just issued a new report on extreme weather events in which they do talk a little bit about better ways to talk about extreme weather. So if you're a scientist or if you know scientists, it's really important to tell them extreme weather events are very, very important. You don't need to have all the details. You don't need to understand everything, but it is enough to say, yes, this is related, and let me tell you how and why, if you're interested. Or if you're not interested, then just, yes, it's related. And don't go into a big harangue about 95% confidence limits and things like that. On the Republican in the White House, so I wrote a book about a disaster scenario, but I still can't quite bear to think about that particular one. The short answer is yes. Well, let me take Ted Cruz first. If Ted Cruz were to be elected, I think you could count on all the promises and progress that have made being completely undermined. Ted Cruz is a flat-out climate change denier. He's been going around using the trope that the warming stopped in 1998, which is a complete falsehood. He's completely in the pocket of Texas oil and gas interests and wants to control women's lives to boot. So I think you could expect all progress to be halted on the federal level. Now, the grounds for hope in the United States is that there's actually a lot going on the state level. A lot of states have implemented renewable portfolio standards. California has an emissions reduction law that's going into effect. Massachusetts is debating the possibility of carbon pricing. So I think that if things really stall out on the federal level, we'll see more action on the state level. So I'm not completely, giving up. And, California is 39 million people. It's an economy the size of France. So what California does really matters, and it sets examples for the rest of the country. So it's not totally hopeless, but it's definitely worrisome. If Donald Trump were to get elected, I think no one has any idea what he would actually do. Because I don't think anybody knows what he actually believes, and possibly even including himself.
No. Thank you very much. Thanks for also very inspiring answers to our questions. I think you helped a lot of us, not only how to think about this, but also about reflecting on what to do about some of the things. So I think we should thank you once more.
Thank you.
Sad and happy and so on, and I think that she would probably have told some story of how this relates to the optimism and pessimism, or something other. You have to ask her. There is a story behind it. Thank you.